Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Fahey, and I am part of the Skoll Foundation team. I'm excited to welcome you to the Skoll World Forum session, Older and Younger in Action, Collaboration for Racial Justice. This year's forum's theme is Closing the Distance. We thought there was no better way to reflect that theme than to invite our global network to design and build a new kind of event together. I need to share a few items before we begin. This session will be recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and ask questions of our speakers. The session is scheduled to end in 60 minutes. Toward the end of the session, and certainly before you leave, please take a few moments to complete the survey in the poll tab to the right of the Hopin video screen. On social media, we are using the hashtag SkollWF and would love for you to do the same. We are thrilled to be able to include this session in this year's virtual Skoll World Forum and want to extend a special thank you to Encore.org for proposing and designing it. With that, I'd like to introduce and hand the session over to our moderator, Jimmy Briggs. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, my name is Jimmy Briggs, and I'm joining you from land originally belonging to the Lenape indigenous peoples, now known as Manhattan. I'm a Skoll Foundation principal leading the racial justice team. Sincerely, it is my pleasure and honor to moderate this session, Older and Younger in Action, Memory, Resilience, and Collaboration. Based on what I know of my colleagues whom you'll meet imminently, I guarantee an engaging, provocative conversation. First, though, I'd like to ask the speakers, as well as you, the audience, for a moment of silence for the family of Dante Wright, who was slain on Sunday in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, for the 8 women who died in a mass shooting last month in Atlanta, Georgia, and for the families of all victims of bias attacks, hate-inspired assaults, and homicide, especially our Asian American and Pacific Islander sisters and brothers who have been the target of escalating public hate over the past year. Please join with me in silence. Thank you. First, I'd like to introduce a dynamic young woman who I so look forward to getting to know beyond our program, Brittany Paschall. Brittany is the founder and board chair of We Remember Nashville, a school teacher in that community, and also an Encore Gen to Gen Fellow. Next, we have Isabel González Whitaker, who I've known and respected for some time now. Atlanta-based herself, Isabel is a journalist and writer, Encore Senior Fellow, and a Presidential Leadership Scholar. I'm especially excited to have Bo Tau Urabe here with us, joining from Minnesota. Bo is the Senior Program Strategist at the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund, Executive Director of the Coalition of Asian American Leaders, and a recent recipient of the Facing Race Award. Finally, my friend, my brother, Raymond A. Jetson. Raymond is the Chief Executive of MetroMorphosis in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a board member of Encore.org. Thank you all for joining us in conversation today. I first want to start off with Brittany, asking if you can share with us briefly, what was your pathway for engaging in activist work in your community?
Absolutely. First, let me say I'm honored to be here with you all near and far, and I bring you greetings from Kusawati Cherokee land, now known as Nashville, Tennessee. I started as a community organizer and activist in my teen years. I started organizing actually around a plan that was called Nashville Next, that was focused on what Nashville would look like over the next 20 years. I really started out doing anti-bias, anti-bigotry work with other young people, and did that until I graduated from high school. When I graduated from high school, I had been in undergraduate school for about 20 days or less when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson. And so I was at the height. I was actually sitting in my sociology 101 class when a discussion about chattel slavery and what had just happened to Mike Brown came up, and I got involved with the movement for Black Lives, stayed involved with the movement for Black Lives for several years until I graduated from college, a little bit after college, and then ended up founding We Remember Nashville, which for me is a public memory project that sits really at the intersection of all my passions. We look at the historical root of racism in the country, right? We trace really from chattel slavery all the way to Reconstruction and lynching, up to mass incarceration, up to the current lynchings that we are seeing, such as the one that we just saw in Minneapolis. And so this work is very, very important to me. It's in my DNA as a great-great-great-granddaughter of an enslaved man, as the daughter of a woman who desegregated public schools. It's in my blood, but I really came to it, like I said, during my teen years here in Nashville, where I had some amazing adults who were older than me, some much older, some just a bit older, who taught me to know my community, taught me to love that community, and then to serve and make my life's work for that community. And that's really where the genesis of my activist and my organizing work started.
Isabel, I want to go to you next. If you can share with us, first of all, your early journey into activism, but how you made the transition from being a full-time journalist here in New York, you moved to Atlanta, Georgia. What's the process been like for you becoming increasingly engaged in the most proximate, most relevant social challenges we're facing as a society today?
Well, it's been, can you all hear me? I hope you can hear me. You'll let me know if you can.
We can, yes.
Okay, I'm having a few technical issues, so I apologize. And thank you for that great question. I knew I come from a mother who is no longer with us, but who left me a different sort of generational wealth, and that is the generational wealth of public advocacy and activism. And her fight has essentially become my fight. And her fight, of course, was to give voice to immigrants and minority communities in the South, especially at a time when it wasn't really expected beyond sort of the traditional black and white dynamic that had been happening historically. So she gave voice to Latinos specifically, but more broadly than that too. And so as a journalist, I kept looking and reaching for purpose in the work that I was doing, but called to wanting to do something more impactful and tactical. And so, she passed, and I had the opportunity to rename a park in her honor. And actually, I should reframe that. It wasn't so much I had the opportunity, I created the opportunity with the help of the mayor of Atlanta at the time, knowing that we wanted to commemorate and honor her life. And that representation, that public representation of a prominent Latino being acknowledged by the city and in the South. And through that, the park has become sacred ground for the immigrant journey in the South. And so it's been extraordinarily fulfilling in a way that's different than journalism can be fulfilling, which I know you can relate to as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Isabel. Looking forward to hearing more about the park, the process of making that happen in your mother's honor. Bo, I want to hold some of your story for later in the conversation, but you're from our prior conversations outside of this session planning, I know that you move through many circles. You work very multiracially, intergenerationally, and I'm just curious how you're able to navigate what seem to navigate effortlessly across age, across community, across ethnicity. I'd love to hear how you came to hold this ability and develop it.
Thanks, Jimmy. And again, good to be here with everybody. It's my honor to also join all of you from Minnesota, or the Minnesota Makoche, which is the homeland of the Dakota people. And, you know, my story is not, I guess, not unlike many other refugees who have made their way to America, in that my family was part of the largest resettlement of refugees to this country post the Vietnam and wars in Southeast Asia. And so I came to America at the young age of 6, and you know, in that journey, landed in on the south side of Chicago, living among really predominantly Black neighbors, and you know, came from a country where my people were targeted for really extinction after the war because we had sided with the U.S. and then landed and inherited racism in this country and had to really learn about that history, and also realized very quickly that systems were not really set up for families like ours to succeed. My parents were farmers. They were agrarian farmers who farmed to live, and then landed in Chicago, you know, and needed to figure out how they were going to adapt. And I very quickly, because I had the opportunity to go to school, I learned English, and by the time I was in second grade, I was my parents' navigator. So I got to go with them everywhere, to doctor's appointments, to the public benefit office, to, you know, their first day on their jobs, and realized that I was becoming such a lifeline for their new, you know, our new life in America. But I felt like that was very much the way that I had grown up. I had always been surrounded by elders, and also recognizing too from my own people's history that it was always the communal that facilitated our ability to survive, and that as much as young people are the future, elders are our connections to our roots and our cultures. So I've always felt that that was a privilege to grow up in that kind of community. And through organizing work, I've learned about, you know, how to fight systems of oppression, but also am trying to bring a lot of my own cultural practices to the work. So I'm happy to be here and can share more as we talk.
Wonderful, both. Thank you so much. Finally, Ray, Mr. Raymond Jetson. Ray, I'd love if you could share with the audience, because I think it's integral to your journey, you know, the importance of legacy and your family's history of organizing and civil disobedience and protest.
I greet you all from the land of the Choctaw, the Homa, and the Bayou Gula people, who actually marked the boundaries of their property with a blood-stained pole that was noted by a French explorer from the river, hence the name, the Red Stick or Baton Rouge. And so I am glad to share with you. One of my earliest memories in life, Jimmy, was a knock on the door late in the evening, early in the night. I don't know, I was a child, but to find my great uncle coming into our house, closing the door quickly behind him, and picking up our phone and dialing the number that I would later learn was the then chief of police in our community. And my great uncle who was like a grandfather to me, was calling to argue with the chief about white police officers coming into the community and forcing themselves upon young Black women. My great uncle's solution to this issue was to put bricks in his car and find the officers in compromising positions and throw bricks through the window. And so that was one of my earliest memories of my childhood. Of course, my father was a son to my great uncle. And so I got to watch these men, my great uncle, who passed on to my father. My great uncle died of a heart attack in his mid-60s. And my father was my absolute hero. And I watched him all of my life pour into our community, only to die at 54. And it was only as I approached my 54th birthday that I began to understand just how young he was when he passed. And as I recently celebrated my 65th birthday, for me, that comes, those 11 years that my father did not get to experience come with a sense of obligation to community, to family. And so for me, giving to make community better is not only a way of life, it is critical to the experience of life.
Thank you so much, Ray. I want to bring, this is going to be a group conversation. I want to bring all of us on the screen together. A lot's been percolated so far. I think, Brittany, started us off with this thread about the work being in her blood, and Bo amplified it, talking about, from a cultural perspective, how community, intergenerational community was always a part of her experience, both in her original country and here in the United States. And I'm wondering, I want to ask this particularly of Isabel and Ray, from your perspectives, what are the culturally grounded intergenerational practices your communities bring to the work of activism and organizing? And Isabel, please go first.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I think that coming from Latino culture, first of all, there, at least as it was specific to my upbringing, we were predisposed to intergenerational, pan-generational connections, right? Like I grew up in a multi-generational household. I grew up with the opportunity to have conversations with my grandparents in very sort of intimate conversations that didn't feel forced or staged or limited to a once a year visit. And through them, I learned their journeys and their stories. And, the ones that resonated with me, certainly, and that empowered me to do the work that I do now, are the ones of struggle and that experience of leaving a country under duress for the opportunity of a better life and to pursue the American dream, which they did at great cost and at great sacrifice. So this idea of legacy was sort of something that I absorbed very early on. And I think I have proximity to thank for that. And in our case, this cultural proximity that I think is really important not to lose and not to lose touch with as we all sort of go on with our lives, right?
Thank you so much, Isabel, for that response. Really appreciate that. What about you, Ray?
So Jimmy, it has been an interesting experience just to watch the consistency of the tension between generations who are working toward the same goal. I recall standing on a street corner near my not far from my childhood home as I watched A.Z. Young and the Deacons for Defense, who marched from Bogalusa, Louisiana, to the state capitol for voting rights, and this was followed by a rally in the park where my great uncle, who was one of 3 African Americans to register to vote in Baton Rouge, a feat that I didn't understand until much later in life. But the contradiction, the tension between my great uncle and his historical acts and this different generation of activists marching from Bogalusa to the state capitol to press their grievances upon the government. But standing across the street were a group of young men with black berets on, with pins that said "Free Angela," with army boots and fatigues on, who would soon become a force in how we understood freedom and equality and opportunity for our community. And so I firmly believe, and I believe that a bit of all of that lives in me. and I try to take the best from each of those and pass them on to the next generation, whose passion and desire and commitment to change inspires me immensely.
Thank you so much for that, Ray. Brittany, I have to confess that since you and I spoke a few weeks ago, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, eager to have more in the future. And one of the things I've been thinking about, based on our conversation and knowing about the work you've done in Nashville, is about the issue, the matter of faith, the church, and engaging with our young people. As you know, and Ray knows this as well, in the Black community, we always say this far by faith. But yet we know from studies, from surveys, that there's been a generational pull away from the quote unquote, the Black church. And I'm curious from your perspective, Brittany, as a representative, I would say, of the new young lions and lionesses in the movement, what impact, what role do you think the church plays now as a center for organizing, for advocacy, for support, but also in mobilizing young people, whether they're on the streets or in other spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that I'll say is that we give the church a lot of credit for participation in movement. I remember a few years ago going to Selma with a group of young people, and the docent from the Brown Chapel AME Church told the story of the women who were at the church, and the women who were caretakers, and the women who fried chicken. And so, yes, the church has been central, has been a hush harper, has been central to movement since really enslavement. And a large part of that is that the women are at the church, right? So a big part of the reason that the movement was that we see people like Fannie Lou Hamer, that we see people like Septima Clark, right, who are great civil rights advocates and activists. We see women, and women make up 80% of the African American church. And so the movement is wherever the women are, and the women are usually at church in Black communities. I think that when you ask the question of what is the role of the Black church, I am part cynical and part optimistic. As a person of faith myself, I know that when I look around at the church I grew up at, in the poorest and in the I grew up at a church that's in 37208, and the most incarcerated African American people are in 37208 in the nation. It's one of the highest places of incarceration. And the church I grew up at did not allow women to speak, teach, or preach, did not have any outreach to that particular community. So I soon found myself having a faith crisis of having to find a church or a body that was more aligned with my social activism work, right? And so I think a lot of young people, a lot of millennials, a lot of Gen Z, I think are finding this themselves in this real dichotomy of saying, like, I want to have a faith, but that faith has to match up with what I believe to be true about people, how I believe people should be dignified, the way that I want to be involved in the movement. And so I think that the church can be central to organizing for the basic human rights and dignities of every human being. But I think that we have to be careful to really have a sense of clarity as people of faith. We have to have a sense of moral responsibility. We have to look towards the places that we see that happening. Folks like Jackie Lewis at Middle Collegiate. We have to look towards this real progressive, radical faith, or we risk not only young people leaving the church, right? I hear a lot of talk about young people are leaving the church. That is potentially dangerous. But what is more of a threat is wasting the capacity that bodies of faith, all faiths, not just Christian faith, can have if they get together. Things like the Black Church Pact, right? Get together, get organized, get on the same page, and really move radically and progressively toward racial justice, social justice in all aspects. And that has to start really, we have to sweep, my grandma used to tell me to sweep my own porch. And so that means, the Black church has to sweep her own porch and has to eliminate the sexism and racism and homophobia from her porch in order to be able to be a force and a catalyst for change. to the broader community and world.
Oof, well said, Brittany. Thank you for that. I see Ray giving you snaps, so I am too off video. Isabel and Bo, I love to, again, respectively, within the Asian American Paschall Islander community and within the Hispanic American community, I'd love to hear your perspective on this question around faith and youth mobilization and engagement as well. Maybe Bo, you could go first, then Isabel.
Sure. Yeah, I think I want to just set the context that I come from a people who have been an oral people for, 5 centuries, right? And we didn't have a written language until the 1950s when Christianity came and wanted to kind of proselytize to the community. And so a written language was developed, and now only still 50% of the population reads and writes in that in that written form. And so, so I think that, faith has always been a part of the community, but it's been really not necessarily the Christianity or those types of things, but we've been impacted by those, right? So, for us, it's understanding how faith centers the ability for the collective to thrive. And so as a culture, the Hmong are animist, and they really believe in the spirits of the natural world, and that all of us have souls and those types of things. And then Christianity, when it came along with kind of colonialism and imperialism. And so there are ways in which the community has interacted with faith. And I think that when you have been a part of a people that has been so persecuted, I think that sometimes faith is what gives people some glimpse of hope to be able to kind of continue. But I also think about my people's stories and histories and know that, in fact, we were not taught to be resilient, but we were born into it. And that is just part of the story. And oftentimes it's through sort of the work of the intergenerational work that people are able to do together, where they can come to some shared understanding and understanding why faith is necessary, but also to know that we have to evolve from sort of thinking of faith as the only savior to really thinking about how faith helps us to continue to have hope and dreams for being able to evolve the practices that have been harmful. So within the community, there's a lot of work, because sometimes faith becomes an excuse for things that are like patriarchal in practice and end up harming women and girls and LGBTQ folks. And so I think there's a lot of that discussion, which I think young people push, right? Because they don't want to believe in a faith that has that kind of, that doesn't allow for that kind of evolution and growth. And so, so I feel like I'm witnessing all the time our community's evolution in trying to create the world that we know is possible, and that can care for all of our communities, both in times where there is extreme harm and hurt, but also when things are well, how can we keep moving forward? So I'm taking a lot of that insight, and just know that I think other communities are grappling with it as well.
I mean, that was so beautifully said, and I feel like I can relate a lot to what you just said, Bo, especially in terms of faith as a vehicle of resiliency, and a sort of a unifying lodestar for surviving through some of the hardest experiences one can experience. I think in the Latino community, it's extremely complicated. There are we're not a monolith, right? That's certainly a refrain that we've heard and now associate with the Hispanic community. And we're not monolithic when it comes to religion. And a lot of our religion too is, I'd say for the younger generations and for the older, but really, and I have an example of this, which is why I'm citing this, rooted in cultural and historic traditions versus traditions that are specific to the church or specific sort of traditional faith. So in this case, I'm talking about the lighting of candles or the incorporation of various, very country specific sometimes, and also rooted in indigenous influences from those countries. And so when I've seen and I can really only speak personally, the mobilization through the lens of faith at my mom's namesake park, which, as a reminder, is the first and only Latino park or park to be named or memorialize a Latino in the state of Georgia. And we've held, I'd say, what we call, sort of these interfaith vigils, spiritual gatherings. It's a very broad, very inclusive, all encompassing honoring of religion as a way to acknowledge and to shed tears and to share and commiserate, for example, over the border crisis. And I think that's been my personal experience as a way to acknowledge and honor our unique spiritual journeys, but also the diversity and plurality of our spiritual journeys. But regardless, the spiritual journey is a very important one to our community at large.
Thank you so much, Isabel. This is a question for the group as a whole, and I love this part of the conversation. We're halfway through, and I'm going to get deeper into it, so to speak. I want to target this question towards Bo initially, but please, all of you, please feel free to jump in when appropriate as you can. Bo, as we recognize here in the United States, the past year in particular has been very challenging, to say the least, for Asian American and Pacific Islanders. The community, broadly speaking, has been the target of both verbal, online, physical attacks, some quite devastating, quite violent, most notably the shootings in Atlanta last month. But even on a week-to-week basis, we're seeing from coast to coast in this country, attacks on sidewalks, street corners, in stores, particularly of Asian American elders. And I'm curious, within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, how has this escalation been catalytic in terms of intergenerational activism for young people and old, particularly given the targeting of Asian American elders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like so many cultures, we place great value on our elders, right? Believing that and in our elders really embody kind of our histories, and we should have great respect for elders. And so I think the attacks on elders has been really hard to watch, not just for us, but probably everybody seeing that. And I think it comes in, at a time where I think for Asian Americans, the history that has been silenced, right? Racism has always been a part of the Asian American story, but it hasn't always been the visible story or the included story. And because Asian American history is quite complex in that really it's only been about 60, almost 70 years now since Asian Americans were really allowed to immigrate to this country, and that we can just look at our own immigration story here in America and see the sprinklings throughout history of how racism was really systematically perpetuated against Asian Americans. But that creates a complexity, because that means that each of our diverse communities within the API community has come at different times and has a different story as it relates to America, right? So my family's story as a Southeast Asian refugee who had a direct tie to America is very different than, the Chinese Americans who came 5 generations ago to help build the transcontinental railroads. and things like that, versus the Japanese Americans who, who were interned and land taken from them, versus now our economy demanding highly educated workers, and we have that influx of immigrants, which we need in order to be economically viable in this country. But the story that gets perpetuated is how immigrants are taking away white men's jobs, right? Or sort of that narrative that is xenophobic. And so it's a complicated story. And I think that we are just starting to really see young people recognize the erasure of that history through their own education, realizing that I too went through my whole education never learning about Asian American history. And it wasn't until I got to college and I was, interested to pay for my own courses to learn about Asian American history. And even then, I didn't see any stories that represented an Asian American person like me, right? And then realized that the reason why that doesn't exist is because much of my own people's stories are really told in the oral form, and that I needed to sit with my elders to understand that story of self. And so, that deep connection that I had to my own community, but recognizing that most Americans knew nothing about, my people's history, right? So it's that kind of complicated web. And now, as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are being attacked in the wake of the pandemic, people are really coming together to sort of say, what does being Asian Americans mean, and how do we fit this picture of systemic racism, and why is it that people know so little about our stories, right? And what is it that we need to also embrace, because there is not a homogenous Asian American community. It's quite diverse, and here in Minnesota alone, we have 40 different ethnic groups who speak almost 100 different languages, right? Whose immigration stories here are quite different, and the economic situations, all of those things are so different, but it's intertwined with the story of America, because the model minority myth, for example, is a direct response that the system had to not responding to the demands of Black people who are fighting for civil rights and equality. And so, Asian Americans went from being the diseased and the yellow peril to all of a sudden becoming the model minorities used in a system to not respond to Black people's demands. And I think we have to not just see our story as, this unique story, but how does it connect with the story of racism in America, right? And I think that there is that level of wondering, and now really saying we need to see more of that, and we need to connect it to the story of America, and that it is really a disservice to young people that they don't hear these stories. And so I see young people demanding for ethnic studies, not for themselves, but for them and all of their peers, because it's necessary. What is education equity if we're not going to educate students about each other's histories? So I'm really proud of the work that our young people are leading, but I'm also seeing elders really come and to share that story as well.
Wow, thank you so much for that framing and response.
Jimmy,
I want to. Yeah, please, Ray, jump in.
I'd love to jump in, and just the richness of those comments, and I thank you so much for them. Probably the most horrific remnant of slavery, racism, and the delusion of white supremacy in this country has been to create this conflict that has caused for example, the Isabels of the world, the Bows of the world, and the Ray and Brittany's of the world to not recognize that our paths have been extremely similar, and that the same tactics that have been used to keep us from recognizing the synergy and the similarities in our experience, and the power that emerges from understanding that and grasping that. That is the hope that I see in the next generation. That is the hope that I see, Brittany, as your generation is joined by so many other groups to say that there's something patently wrong that's baked into the DNA of all of this, and it must be challenged. And so that is the hope that I see in the next generation, and it is this recognition that there is this interrelatedness, that both our paths, our past, and our futures are inextricably bound to one another. And the path to true equity, to true freedom, to true opportunity in this country is recognizing that we are, in fact, all in this together. And that is the message that I consistently seek to plant and to seed within those who are of succeeding generations as I have an opportunity.
Yeah, I love this. It's so rich. I think something, Bo, you mentioned how students are demanding ethnic studies. And I love that. But the K-12 educator in me says that regardless of our students' origins or countries of background or ethnicities, they shouldn't have to demand ethnic studies, because they should get a culturally competent education from when they're high 3-year-olds up into 12th grade. That's our responsibility as an educator. As educators, I am one, I teach every day, to make sure that all of my students see themselves represented. And if the canon, right, if the United States canon, the English canon, the social studies, the historical narrative does not represent them, then how do I as an educator and how do we as educators make them feel represented and make them seen? Because what you're really speaking to when you say, our tradition is oral, our tradition, I needed to sit down with elders, that is so key and that is so important. It is also important that we expand our ways of knowing, that we say, if our students come from oral traditions, how do we represent them in the classroom so that their oral tradition is brought into the space? So I definitely wanted to respond to that. And then to this idea that Ray spoke of, Raymond, I agree with you. I have a lot of hope for the intergenerational cross movement energy and synergy that I think we're really seeing. Especially, it's something that I've seen in the movement since I've been in the movement, but especially after summer 2020. Like, I looked up and we were in the middle of COVID-19 crisis. And when you look at just the colorful display of protests, right, there are all types of people showing up for George Floyd, right, for Breonna Taylor, a few nights ago for Dante, right? There are all types of people. And I think that is when I first came to intergenerational organizing, I came up in an intergenerational household. I told you my mom desegregated schools, and I was used to the presence of elders. It was normal for me, but that wasn't always the case for the people I organized with. And young people had some qualms with older people, right? Like, about some things that went down. But the way that even when I stepped into it, we agree on more than we disagree about. I know Panthers. I know folks that sat at lunch counters at Woolworth on 5th. And we can disagree that if you spit on me, I have to sit there, right? We can disagree on our tactics, but we agree about the basic dignity of humans. We agree that racial injustice is wrong. We agree that we all have certain rights and that we should get to live free, and that Black people should be able to drive and have a traffic stop and not die from it. And I think that's what when we get to the core of it, we have to find what we agree on. We have to find those points of tension, and we have to seek to not eliminate those as much as we seek to work through those points of tension, right? And stick it out with each other so that we can do the work. Audre Lorde, I'll close with saying this on this particular point, says that if I am not free of any woman, and I'll amend this, if any person is unfree. And I think that that's the spirit that I see. That's the spirit that I hope to continue to see. And honestly, that's the spirit that keeps me in the work. Because in the middle of a trial about a Black man getting shot and I'm sorry, a Black man having a knee on his neck for 8 minutes, another Black man gets shot, I have to have that hope, right? That this intergenerational cross movement thing we're doing is going to get us free, or I couldn't get up and go teach my kids every day.
Brittany, I love that response. You mentioned the sit-in movement, the Panthers, and Black feminism in that response. So I appreciate you for that. That was amazing. I'm really appreciating personally this that we have now around the importance of visibility and representation story. In recent months we've seen 2 films, Good Trouble about John Lewis, and most recently Judas and the Black Messiah about Fred Hampton, Black Panther chairman in Illinois. We released recently. We've seen Minari, a film about Korean American immigrants. We've seen a film like Parasite win the Best Picture in the Academy Awards. I'd love to go deeper before inviting questions from the audience into the importance of story and memory, how it's transferred, how it's held. Being a native of St. Louis, Missouri, I remember vividly reporting in the aftermath of Michael Brown Jr.'s murder in 2014, which Brittany referenced earlier. A frequent chant that was said was, especially to the elders and older folks who were on the streets as well with younger generations, was, "This is not your grandmother's movement. This is not your granddad's movement." And I'm curious, Ray, from your perspective, through your work with MetroMorphosis, how you address the generational tensions that Brittany alluded to in her response.
I think that it is important to help folks to see that we're not actually starting anything. As passionate as we can be about a particular situation or circumstance, we are merely stepping into something that predates us by generations. I would argue that whatever I do today, or whatever my son does, or whatever one of my younger colleagues does, is merely a continuation of the first 3 Black folks registering to vote in 1932 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so it's understanding that this is a movement. And this movement has a number of different iterations, and that it changes over time. But as Brittany pointed to, the core remains the same. It's about people's freedom. It's about being treated with dignity and respect. It's about being able to simply be my melanin self and not have that be a reason for me to die in this country. And that's been the same battle that predates us by generations. And so it's helping to see how all of this gets situated and finding those points at which we do agree and moving forward in that.
Thank you so much, Ray. Bo and Isabel, I'm curious from your perspectives. We'll do Bo first and Isabel. How do we keep each other visible? What I mean is, this country, as we can all agree on in this conversation, has historically, to the present point, to this moment, historically framed race as a dichotomy, Black and white. We know because of our education, because of our, global understanding of intersectionality, of collective justice and movement building, that is not the case. But how do as we're facing protest seemingly daily in response to police-involved shootings of Black and Hispanic men and women. As we're facing seemingly daily verbal assaults, online assaults, physical attacks of our Asian American Pacific Islander sisters and brothers, as we're facing daily, weekly, the criminalization, the deportation of our Hispanic sisters and brothers, how do we across community ensure that our respective challenges are being seen by all of us in the larger society? But how do we make sure that we're supporting each other even in the midst of pernicious challenges we may be facing as a community? I'd like Bo to go first, and then Isabel, if possible.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think it's exactly where we are right now, right? I would say that as much as we have to talk about systemic racism, we have to do it without centering whiteness, right? And what that means is really that we really believe that no group should control and be able to have power and control and ability to determine rules for everybody else. And that the way to do that is really through multiracial multiculturalism, right? And if we believe in that, then we can actually embrace and see each other because we know how to do that. We come from people who do that. It's our cultures that teach us about, having roots and being able to have futures. And when we come into contact with people who are different than us, we know how to treat them. And that doesn't center whiteness. And so I want to say that when I think about what is happening now and the values in which we move forward with is to talk about systemic racism, but really to decenter whiteness and to do it in a way that really values what we know intrinsically from our cultures, right? That gives me really a lot of hope because I feel like when I do that, then I remember what my parents and grandparents, my great-grandparents, their stories about how they solve problems, how they treat people who are different than them, and what it is that they aspire to do. And that along the journey, I think, as Ray said, every generation before us have made things better for us. And maybe progress has stalled or hasn't gone as fast as we'd like, but it's a great reminder about that we know youth will win. And what we learn from our cultures is that, and when we decenter whiteness, then it becomes less about competition in the ego, but it becomes about our collective well-being and believing that there is abundance and that we can take care of each other. And when we see people who are treated unfairly or inhumanely, that we can not just have chronic empathy, but that we have the both the will and the power to change that, right? And so I really just believe in that because that's what I learned from being a part of my culture, right? That I always belong. And it wasn't trying to replace me, and I'm not trying to replace the next person. So as I think about how we move forward, I hope that I'm bringing that to the movement work that I'm a part of.
Yeah, I co-sign all of that. And I think you said that beautifully. You cannot stand for your community and not stand for other communities when, as Ray so smartly pointed out, we are all being subjected to the same attempts at muting our voices in various, sometimes more tragic and also less tragic ways. We must stand together. And that's what I see happening with youth, but I also see it driving behavioral changes across generations. And that's gives me additional hope, right? The youth will save us, but it's the generational approach to change things forward.
And I'll ask this question for the group and an entire group. Whoever wants to take the question. This is from the audience. How do you recommend? There's a lot of cynicism. There's a lot of suspicion, and Brittany alluded to this in her early response, of people who are credentialed or so-called experts or talking heads we see often on television and other media. Suspicion of their intent, suspicion of their authenticity or credibility as representatives or leaders of frontline movement activism. How do you mitigate or address those suspicions, to bring in people who want to do the work, who want to be a part of multiracial, intergenerational efforts for justice, but have mistrust? But I said, Brittany alluded to it earlier. There's a disagreement of tactics. There's a disagreement on motivations, and that question's for anyone who wants to take it.
Yeah, asking why, thinking critically, being suspicious is the best tool I have as an organizer. Right? When I show up somewhere, something's happening, the community is outraged, like I've got to be suspicious. I've got to be curious. It's how I steward that. So I would say you have every right to be suspicious of internet activists. There is a real trend of people who know nothing about actual organizing, who actually don't show up. And I don't mean that in an ableist way. I don't mean just physically, who don't know the communities that they're serving, who don't know the issues, who have not bridged gaps between the elders and the younger folks that are on CNN, maybe MSNBC, right, tweeting. That's a very valid concern. And that concern is not more important than the work. So interrogate that curiosity. And the best way to do that is to show up. So to find out who the voices are in the community. And so when you look to the margins, right, who do the Black people and the brown people trust in your community, right? Go where they are and get proximal to the issue, right? Show up at the community oversight meeting. Show up at the council meeting, right? And watch and listen and determine and build your own relationships, right? Once you determine and build your own relationships and use your own discernment, there's work in that. But I think that the payoff of saying, like, I'm cynical, I don't want to be involved because they're internet activists versus people's lives are actually at stake if I don't get involved. I personally always think that I'm going to choose the latter, right? Like, we have to, sometimes I think cynicism is a stagnation, right? You become stagnant. It's like, I'm cynical. I can't trust anybody. And so we don't do anything. And that's exactly where oppression does its best work, right? King writes to the white moderate. He's not writing to the KKK. He's writing to the white moderate. That's like, he's writing to other clergy, actually. And he's saying, like, y'all are supposed to be about this and y'all are confused. That's not what he said, but that's how I read it, right? That's Brittany's take of it. Like, y'all should be I should be having to tell you this, like, what's going on? And so we cannot allow ourselves to become stagnant and create inaction, or oppression does its best work there, right? Because I'm going to say this: white progressives are the thorn in my side. I know exactly who the KKK is. It was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, which is 75 miles down the road from me. I know what they're showing up. I know what the Proud Boys are showing up to do. White progressives might tweet out yesterday about Dante and tomorrow not understand why we should be locking babies up at the border. So don't allow that cynicism to turn into stagnation and inaction. That would be how I wrap all of that up.
And that does wrap it all up, brother.
Yeah, Brittany, I have nothing else to add to that, actually. Yeah. I will say, again, for the audience, thank you for joining us. This conversation will be available for later viewing after the forum. I want to thank Raymond Jetson. I want to thank Bo. I want to thank Isabel. I want to thank Brittany. Thank you so much for your authentic voices, your representation, your leadership in your respective communities and movements, and appreciate you're doing this conversation. To the audience, thank you for joining us and staying with us, and have a great forum. Take care, everyone.